I said, bring me down. Can't none bring me down. The love is too high to bring me down. Can't none bring me down. I said, cause I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. Cause I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you know what happiness is to you. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like that's what you want to do. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you know what happiness is to you. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like that's what you want to do. Bring me down, can't none bring me down. The love is too high to bring me down. Can't none bring me down. I said, cause I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you know what happiness is to you. Clap along if you feel like that's what you want to do. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like a room without a roof. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth. Because I'm happy. Clap along if you know what happiness is to you. Clap along if you feel like that's what you want to do.
Even the Canadian staff band is happy. Canadian staff bandmaster does smile every now and then. But the question is, are you happy? Because you're Salvationists, and that video proves that you're supposed to be happy. The Salvation Army was supposed to be a happy religion. If you read an old book like Bramwell Booth's Echoes and Memories, then you'll see that actually the established churches really disliked Salvation Army meetings when we first started, because they were too noisy and they were too joyous and they weren't holy enough. That's what Salvation Army worship is supposed to be like. That's what Salvationists are supposed to be like. Actually, it's what Christians are supposed to be like. We are supposed to be happy. Why are we supposed to be happy? Well, because the God that we worship is happy. Now, we've talked about this in terms of love earlier in the year, and we looked at those verses from 1 John, and we said that God doesn't just love, He is love. Love is part of His nature. It's His essence. And the same is true of happiness. God doesn't have happiness. He is happiness. Happiness is His nature. Happiness is His essence. And so there is nothing that you can do to make God more happy than He is at the moment. And conversely, there's nothing that you can do that will make Him less happy than He is at the moment. Because God is happiness. His nature, His essence is happiness. And our God is a giving God. He is a sharing God. And so if happiness is His nature, then it stands to reason that He wants to share that happiness with us. He wants us to be happy. He wants individual Christians, individual Salvationists to be happy. And He wants the Salvation Army to be happy. Because He wants to give His happiness to us. God is happiness. And He wants to share happiness with us. And so, right at the commencement of our passage this morning, Paul writes to the Philippian church, and he says to us as Christians this morning as well, these words from verse 4. always be full of joy in the Lord. I say it again, rejoice. Now that's one of those Bible verses that everybody loves. I love preaching on this section because I love these verses. Very often I will use them when I go on a pastoral visit, and people will say, oh, these are some of my favourite verses. But just stop for a minute and think, why are these our favourite verses? Because when you stop to think what Paul is saying in verse 4, they should really be one of the most disliked verses. So different, so countercultural is it, so counter to what we do so often, that it should jump out at us. Paul says, always be full of joy in the Lord. Always. Can you imagine this letter being read out to the Philippian church for the first time? You can imagine those two old ladies at the back. I'm not looking at anybody in particular, but those two old ladies in the back who hear the person reading out the letter, always be full of joy in the Lord. And you can imagine them saying, what did he say? Always be full of joy in the Lord. You mean whatever our circumstances, always be full of joy in the Lord? I think that's why Paul had to repeat it. I think that's why the end of the verse says, I say it again, rejoice. For those two old ladies at the back who didn't hear the first time, I say it again, rejoice. For those of you sitting there thinking, what, always be full of joy in the Lord? Surely not. Surely not. Always be full of joy in the Lord. Paul was writing to a church who would have been, in the early days of the church, subject to persecution. Always in fear of their lives, always in fear of what was going to happen next. And Paul has the audacity to say to them, always be full of joy in the Lord. What, when our lives are in danger? Surely you don't mean that, Paul. Now, the difficulty that the Philippian church had was they couldn't say to Paul, well, it's all right for you to say that there in your palace, wherever you are, or hidden away in a cave somewhere, because Paul was writing this letter to the Philippian church from prison in Rome. And what I've learned as a preacher is that you can't preach something unless you live it out for yourself first, because somebody will pick you up on it and say, well, hang on a minute, is this all about do as I say, not do as I do? So Paul must have had to apply these words to his life. There he was, languishing in prison in Rome, in dark and dirty conditions, no doubt, certainly without any kind of supplies, unless people were willing to supply him, as we hear later in the passage. And he must have had to apply to himself first, in his difficult circumstances, always be full of joy in the Lord. Again, I say, rejoice. Do you really mean that, Paul, sitting there in your prison cell in Rome? Do you really mean it for us as a people who face persecution and danger of death every day? Yes. Rejoice in the joy of the Lord. Again, just in case you don't get it, again, I say rejoice. So how do we do that? When our circumstances are difficult, when they're joyless, when they're upsetting, does Paul really mean that when you're grieving the loss of a loved one, that you should always rejoice, that you should always be full of joy in the Lord? How can that be? Does Paul really mean that if you've lost your job, or for some other reason you're worried about whether you can put food on the table tomorrow, that you should always be full of joy in the Lord? Surely he doesn't mean that. Again, I say rejoice. Does Paul really mean that when my relationships are broken down, when I've fallen out with a friend, or when I've fallen out with my spouse, or fallen out with my brother and sister, whoever, fallen out with people at work, whatever it is, that I should always be full of joy in the Lord? Surely Paul doesn't mean that. Again, I say, rejoice. How can Paul say that? He can say it because our joy, our happiness should be based not on our circumstances, but on a relationship. We are happy not because of our circumstances. We are happy because we are living life in union with Jesus Christ. That's the source of our happiness. That's the secret to happiness. We are living life in union with Christ. And so our happiness doesn't come from our circumstances. Sometimes there are really difficult circumstances, and we know people who are going through difficult circumstances today. It's not about those difficult circumstances. It's because we have the power of Christ. It's because we have the hope of Christ in our life. Even when everything else seems to be falling apart, when life seems hopeless, we can rejoice in the joy of the Lord because we find our hope in Him. Our happiness is centered on Jesus Christ, not on our circumstances. And so Gordon Fee, following what Paul has to say in Philippians chapter 4, verse 4, says, joy, unmitigated, untrammeled joy is, or at least should be, the distinctive mark of the believer in Christ Jesus. What sets you and me apart from the people in our community, the people around us, should be that we have untroubled, unmitigated joy. Because we have it in our relationship with Jesus Christ, not in our circumstances. So if that isn't difficult enough, hands up those who think that's difficult. No, you all think this is wonderful. Thank you, Stuart. Ian. If that's not difficult enough, Paul then goes on to a bit and turns the screw a little bit more, because in verse 6 he says, don't worry about anything, instead pray about everything. Tell God what you need and thank Him for all He has done. I love the way that this is translated in the New Living Translation. Don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. Now, I want to take a straw poll this morning. Okay, confession time. You don't have to do this, but if you're willing to confess to your family, your church family this morning, then do so. Hands up if you're a worrier. Quite a few honest people around, okay? Now, those who put their hands up and said, yes, I'm a worrier, put your hand up if worrying makes you happy. No one. Even the world's biggest, best worrier doesn't do it because it makes them happy. Worry does not make us happy. Nobody is happy about worrying. When we worry, we think, why are we worrying? If you're a really good worrier, then when you worry, you start worrying about why you're worrying, because you shouldn't be a worrier. Anxiety and worry and fear rob us of our happiness. And so that's why Paul says, don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. Now, if you're a worrier, and I would say probably 2/3 of the congregation in the hall put their hands up when I asked if they were a worrier, and by the way, I didn't put my hand up, but I should. So 2/3 of the people in this room are worriers. I suspect amongst the other third, there may well be some others who decided not to put their hands up. So there's a good majority of people in the hall this morning, and I suspect online as well, who are worriers. And so when they hear Paul say, don't worry about anything, they think, well, that's easy for you to say. Oh, it's as easy as that. Don't worry about anything. So how do we not worry about anything? The answer is in that verse. The answer is to center your worry, your anxiety, your fear on your relationship with Jesus Christ. Because Paul doesn't say, don't worry about anything. He says, don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. If we could learn to turn our worries into prayers, then we would be centering our anxiety and our fear on Jesus Christ. Because to pray is simply to open up that relationship that we have with Jesus Christ. If you want to have a relationship with someone, then you have to talk to them. Okay, that might come as a bit of a surprise to some husbands and wives, I don't know. Okay, but you have to talk to them. When we talk to them, then we open up our relationship with them and we turn our worries over to conversation with God. We center on our relationship with God. And instead of worrying, we tell God about what we need. And then we thank him for everything that he's already done in our lives. And do you know what I've found? When we do remember to do this, our worries are suddenly forgotten. Because we realize we're handing our worries on to someone who's greater than all our anxiety and our fear put together. He's the one who can answer our worries and our fears. And when we do that, we discover happiness. Why? Because as Paul goes on to say, when we do that, when we stop worrying about anything and we pray about everything instead, then we find God's peace. The peace that is beyond all understanding. We find happiness. As I say, this is not Paul just pontificating for the sake of it. As we learn later in the passage, and these two passages are quite often split up and we preach on them at different times. In fact, I've preached on the two halves at different times. But there's something about putting them together this morning because Paul isn't just saying, look, all you've got to do is stop worrying and pray about everything. All you've got to do is be happy and rejoice in the Lord. What he goes on to say in the final verses is, I've already discovered this secret. I've discovered this secret of happiness for myself. This comes from my experience. This is not just me pontificating about what you should do. I've discovered it for myself. He's found happiness. He's found joy for himself. And so in verses 11 and 12, he says, not that I was ever in need, for I have learned how to be content. I've learned how to be happy. I've learned how to have joy in my life with whatever I have. Go on to the next verse. I know how to live on almost nothing or with everything. I've learned the secret of living in every situation. I've learned the secret of happiness, whether it's with a full stomach or empty, with plenty or little. Paul says, this is grounded in my experience with Jesus Christ. I've learned to be content. I've learned to be happy in every circumstance I face. I'm happy when I have plenty, and lots of human beings are happy when they have plenty, but I'm also happy even when I'm in need. I know how to cope with both. I know how to be happy. I know how to be joyful in both circumstances. And why? Because just as we said about the first half of the passage, Paul's happiness is based on his relationship with Jesus Christ. And so the verse that we sometimes take out of context, but which follows from those two verses, is verse 13, where he says, for I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. Not I can do everything in my own strength. I can learn how to be happy in my own strength, whatever my circumstances. I could be in the worst circumstances possible, but I have the strength and the power in my life to be happy and to be joyful and to be the kind of salvationist that God wants me to be. No, it's through Christ. I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. Paul says, I come to you, Philippian church, I come to you, Christians of Basingstoke and beyond today, not self-sufficient, but Christ-sufficient. Not self-sufficient, but Christ-sufficient. So my question this morning is this. Would you like to be like Paul? Anybody? Would you like to be like Paul? I'm not necessarily talking about being in a prison cell in Rome. But would you like to find the secret of happiness for yourself? Would you like to be able to say, I'm content in whatever circumstances I find myself in? Thank you, Aidan. One person who wants to be like Paul. Anybody else who says, yeah, that's the kind of life I want. I want to be content in every circumstance, whether I find myself in difficult and bad circumstances or in good circumstances. I don't want to go over the top with joy and happiness when I'm feeling good, but I also don't want to fall into the depths of despair when I find myself in difficult circumstances. I want to find somewhere good in the middle. I want to be able to say, I always find joy, I always rejoice in the joy of the Lord. I found that peace that's beyond all understanding. I'm content in whatever circumstances that I find myself in. Then the answer is, as I said last week, Jesus. If you don't know the answer to the question, the answer to the question is Jesus. It starts with our relationship with God. It starts with our relationship with Jesus Christ. He is the secret to a happy life. He is the true source of our happiness. He is the true source of our fulfillment. He is the true source of our pleasure. And here's what Pastor Timothy Keller has to say about it. Here's the irony. The less you're concerned about your happiness and the more you're concerned about God, the happier you get. Anybody discovered that for themselves? The less you're concerned about your happiness and the more you're concerned about God, the happier you get. This is not a trick. You can't say, oh great, I have it. What I do is I come to God and I say this and this and this. You cannot bandy with the omnipotent and omniscient Lord of the universe. I wish I could write like that. It comes from a sermon as well. I wish I could speak like that. You cannot bandy with the omnipotent and omniscient Lord of the universe. Aim at heaven and you will get earth thrown in. Aim at earth and you get neither. That's profound, isn't it? Aim at heaven and you will get earth thrown in. Aim at earth and you get neither. If you aim for earthly happiness, then very often it's elusive. If you aim at heavenly happiness, then very often you get earth thrown in. It's based on our relationship with Jesus Christ. So how can we be more concerned about God and less concerned about our happiness? Hands up if you remember Disney's Peter Pan. A few of you. What do you have to do in order to be able to fly? Oh dear, it's been a long time since you've seen it. You have to think happy thoughts. See if this reminds you.
But Peter, how do we get to Neverland?
Fly, of course.
Fly?
It's easy. All you have to do is to... Huh, that's funny.
What's the matter? Don't you know?
Oh, sure. It's just that I never thought about it before. Say, that's it. You think of a wonderful thought.
Any happy little thoughts?
Uh-huh.
Like toys at Christmas? Sleigh bells? Snow?
Yep. Watch me now. Here I go. It's easier than pie.
He can fly! He can fly! He flew!
If you want to fly like Peter Pan, then you have to think of a wonderful thought. Yeah, I'm not going to demonstrate, don't worry. I don't think there are enough happy thoughts in the world to lift me off the platform. But if you want to fly, then you think of a happy thought. Or, if you want to find the secret of happiness, then as Paul says in verse 8, fix your thoughts on what is true and honourable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise. If you want to find the secret of happiness, if you want to ensure that your life is centred on your relationship with Jesus Christ and not on your circumstances, then fix your eyes. Fix your thoughts on what is true, what is honourable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise. That's how we find the secret to happiness. If we live true lives, if we live honourably, if we live our lives justly, if we live our lives purely, if we live commendably, then we will discover the source of our joy. It's Jesus. It's Jesus. We're going to sing a prayer together at song number 290 in the songbook. And this first verse, praise to Jesus. Will you take my eyes? Will you take my thoughts off the earth? Will you take my eyes and my thoughts off my circumstances, and will you focus them on my relationship with Jesus Christ instead? George Crowley writes, Spirit of God, descend upon my heart, wean it from earth, wean my heart from earth, through all its pulses move. Stoop to my weakness, mighty as thou art, and make me love thee as I ought to love. If you're struggling this morning to take your eyes and your thoughts off your circumstances, whether they're great circumstances or difficult circumstances, if you're finding it difficult to focus your eyes and your thoughts and your heart on your relationship with Jesus Christ, then this is the moment for you. This is the moment to respond. In the hall, you can respond by coming and using our mercy seat. Just try and keep a little bit of social distancing if you can. If you want somebody to pray with you, then bring a piece of paper in your hand, and perhaps the best thing to do is to go out from the hall and go and speak with that person. If you want to come and pray on your own, then come empty-handed. If you're at home, you can respond. You can kneel by your sofa or your chair or wherever it is that you're sitting at the moment. You can put something in the chat. You can send a message after the meeting and ask us to pray for you. But we can respond. Take my eyes, take my thoughts, take my heart off my circumstances and help me to see you. Help me to be always full of joy in the Lord. Let's pray this prayer together as we sing these verses. Thank you, Derek. I don't want anybody to misunderstand me this morning. This is not a message about getting a grip, or whatever it was the Prime Minister said earlier in the week. It's not about getting a grip and just forgetting your circumstances and getting on with life. It's about not trying to deal with your difficult circumstances in your own strength. How do we find joy that is beyond comparison? The source is Jesus Christ himself. We can't do it in our own strength. That's why we sang in the third verse, teach me the struggles of the soul to bear. Teach me how to always be full of joy in the Lord, to check the rising doubt, the rebel sigh. Teach me the patience of unanswered prayer. Let's sing those third and fourth verses again, please.